Hi everybody. Today's topic is the Ukraine invasion. Subheader is forgiveness and true empathy. I would like to frame this chapter in stating the following. We, as course students, we have our own path. Each of us has his or her own path. Each path is different, and each of us is walking that path to the best of their ability, obviously. The thoughts in this segment do not apply to non-course students. They only apply to course students. And neither should those thoughts that we're going to discuss here be taken as a justification to stay aloof, above, and disconnected from tragic events like the one we're experiencing right now. That aloofness would be a tragedy, would be tragic in and of itself. As Jesus says in the Course, it is almost impossible to deny the body's existence in the world and our reactions to it, to what's going on. So, to that end, the goal of the Course is to get us in touch with what lies below the surface, right? What lies in our unconscious mind. Forgiveness, as the Course defines it, opposite of what everybody thinks about it, or a lot of people think about it, is not just some happy thing we do, right? Forgiveness is not a happy thing. What comes after forgiveness is a happy thing, but forgiveness itself is not a happy thing. Forgiveness is basically looking at our darkness, right? Can be terrifying and very upsetting to look at one's ego in action, as we will see in a minute. So the only reason why Jesus talks in such detail about the ego thought system is so that we can look at it openly and in time, over this process that we're going through with the Course, decide against it, right? But we can't decide against something we have no idea is there. So the goal of the Course is always to shed light onto our unconscious ego. And a big part of learning the principles of the Course is through the application of those principles into our lives. There's really no learning without this application. If we stay on the theoretical level, we don't learn what the Course really wants us to teach, and what wants us to learn. We have to apply those principles onto situations in our daily lives. And the principle we're applying is the principle of forgiveness. And what follows from forgiveness is true empathy. In one sense, in order for us to arrive at the thought system of true empathy, which is the Holy Spirit's thought system, we must first look at false empathy and then go beyond it, right? That's the process with the Course. If you see this this kind of sequence, this is basically this section that we're just discussing, simplified into this little phrase. So if true empathy, if looking at the conflict in Ukraine, what's going on right now, with true empathy, what this means is we look at false empathy without judgment. And looking at false empathy without judgment is forgiveness. Right? We're just applying the principles of forgiveness to true and false empathy right now. We have done it through, in other topics in other segments. But today we're looking at true versus false empathy. So step one in this process. Step one is basically to state what is. And we state what is without spiritualizing it. We state what is without throwing coarse phrases at it. Right? The first step is to feel what we feel and become aware of what we think. Ukraine has been attacked and invaded by Russia. The first step is to become aware of our thoughts about it, right? We might feel angry, sad, scared, upset, indifferent, or maybe empowered. We might feel pity or a sense of pride. We might feel for the victims of the attack, the displaced or killed, the dying, and the ones who are fighting back. We might feel at once powerless and furious. We might feel connected to the Ukrainian people and the Russian people, and we might hate Putin and the ones who cheer him on. We might feel elated while watching Ukrainian people defend themselves. Right? So stating what we feel and think without sugarcoating it and wrapping it in spiritual phrases is the first step. It's a very, very important step. All three steps that we're discussing are equally important. If we leave out one of those three steps, the whole thing collapses, right? If we only apply two of those three or one of those three, it doesn't work. Chances are we feel for the people for Ukraine, right? And we hate Putin. That's a very good start for this exercise. It's beneficial to let it all come to the surface, really. Perhaps maybe write by writing it down or talking to somebody about it, or just thinking about it for a bit. Basically letting our true feelings and thoughts about that situation rise up is necessary before we can go to the next step. We should never skip this step, right? We should always become aware of what we feel and think about a situation, in this case, Ukraine. And we should fully let everything we feel come to the surface, right? Without trying to correct it. The first step is this pure, raw. As a writer, I always compare it to a first draft. You basically put everything on paper. You don't care about how things work, editing or grammar or spelling mistakes. You basically put everything out. And that's the same with this step, right? We want to be as honest as possible and be clear about what we feel about the situation. Step two would in one sense be the miracle. As the Course states, quote, "The miracle is the first step in giving back to cause the function of causation." That's in chapter 28, section 2. So once we've stated clearly what it is we think and feel about the situation, we can go to step two, which is to bring our attention from the world that we perceive back into our mind, right? To do this, let's review briefly how we got here in the first place and how the attack on the Ukraine fits into that. So into the oneness of heaven, right? Into the perfect union of God and his Son. Quote, "Into eternity where all is one, there crept a tiny mad idea at which the Son of God remembered not to laugh." That's chapter 27, section 8. And all of us as one Son of God took that idea seriously. And because we took it seriously, quote, "did the thought become a serious idea and possible of both accomplishment and real effects." That's text 27, section 8. So we forgot the voice for God, right? The Holy Spirit, and we believed the ego that told us that we had done it, that we are now an individual. The price, though, the ego says, the price of our individuality is the death of God. And that's when the belief in sin was born. And from it came an experience of guilt that was so intense that we made a bargain with the ego, and we promised the ego never to abandon it, ever, right? And in return, the ego promised us to help keep our individual existence intact, but without this tremendous guilt that was attached to it. As our mind at this point is now a battlefield, right, where an angry father pursues his guilty son. That is in the Manual for Teachers, chapter 17. And the only choice at that moment in this battlefield of our mind is to kill or be killed. There's no other choice. We make the world from our guilt, and we identify with one figure in it to escape the battlefield our mind has become. Now in the world, our goal is to continually get rid of the sin we believe we have committed while keeping the separation alive. So it's important to understand at this moment that our individual self can only continue to exist if the separation is upheld. Without separation, there is no individual existence. Both are together, right? One cannot be without the other. Our individual self can only stay alive if the separation is 100% ongoing, without interruption. The moment we see that the separation is no longer upheld anywhere we look at, the ego feels threatened, panics, right? At the same time, though, the pain over the separation from God is so intense that we ask the ego for help, to help us reduce it at least. And that's why the ego provides us with pseudo-joining, where the separation is seemingly healed or overcome, right? Grasping for straws, how we always see ourselves when we're with the ego. That's our default setting, grasping for straws when we're with the ego. We are content with that scenario, with that pseudo-joining, and we don't question it. So let's look at the Ukrainian invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine in this light. The end goal here with this segment is to see the conflict with true empathy, not false empathy. Chapter 16, section 1 in the text talks specifically about, the chapter is called True Empathy, but most of the chapter is about false empathy of the ego. Chapter 16, section 1. The means for reaching true empathy is forgiveness. We cannot reach true empathy without looking at false empathy without judgment first, which is forgiveness, right? We cannot reach this without this. So in the first step that we just discussed before, we look at the problem as we see it, right? Without any sugarcoating it, without spiritualizing it. Basically an honest assessment of how we feel and what we think. In step 2, the current step, we realize that if we see the Ukraine invasion the way we see it, it is because we want to see it that way, right? It doesn't just happen on the outside and it is being imprinted on us and, oh, we see it like it is, right? We're never upset about any given situation but only about our interpretation of that situation. That's probably one of the most important concepts in this course. And there's another segment on this channel called The Call for Love, and I discuss it in depth there. So our interpretation of the Ukraine invasion serves a very specific purpose. And that purpose is to keep our individual existence intact, but without the sin and guilt that come with it. That is our goal while looking at this scenario. Our interpretation of the Ukraine invasion is that Russia, the aggressor, has invaded and victimized an innocent country. As our ego counsels us how to best get rid of our guilt, right? That's what it does. Reinforce our innocence in the eyes of God and keep our separate selves intact. We interpret the Ukraine invasion with that as our goal. If we're with the ego, our goal is to get rid of our sin, to keep the separation intact. That's our goal with the ego. There are no other goals, right? So we look at the invasion of Ukraine by Russia with the ego. That is the purpose of our interpretation of what's happening. The Course says identification is salvation. And that's another one of those top 10 important sentences in the Course, right? Identification is salvation. This principle covers everything in our lives. And that's in the text, chapter 12, section 3. So in order for us to appear innocent, we must, under the ego's rule, identify with innocence against the guilty ones, right? In order to find innocence, we must find the guilty ones. One isn't without the other. And clearly identify that guilty one. It's very important. It says in the Course, hatred is specific. In our case, Ukraine is innocent and Putin is guilty. We identify with the Ukrainian people against Putin because this, as per the ego's counsel, guarantees our salvation. Identification is salvation. We identify with innocence against the guilty ones, and that's what we believe will save us. As we said before in this channel, the one phrase that it's not in the Course, but it basically, that's what the ego does. It tells us God hunts the guilty, not the innocent, right? He wants to get the life back that we stole from him after we took the tiny mad idea seriously. And he will take the life from the guilty ones, not the innocent ones, right? So identifying with the Ukrainian people against Putin is how we ensure that our individual existence is preserved, but without the sin attached to it. The sin and guilt in this case are attached to Putin. They are attached to maybe Russia, right? Putin and Russia are simply placeholders. 4 weeks ago, those placeholders were different names were in those placeholders, right? And you have had many in the past. Those are placeholders. As the Course says, another can be found. We always, within the ego thought system, we always have to find a guilty one. That is, like when we're in a body, we have to breathe. When we're with the ego, we have to find a guilty one. Because the ego is the personified belief in sin and separation. So this way of interpreting this conflict in Ukraine ensures that the separation stays intact. And if the separation stays intact, our individual existence stays intact also. And the best way to make the separation real, if we think about it, right, is by the division of good versus evil. Identifying with the good against the evil is the ultimate way of keeping the ego alive. Because this ensures this identification of we identify with the good against the evil, right? It ensures that we have someone to attach our belief in sin to, so it rests with them and not with us, right? We're innocents, as we clearly identify with the innocent victims in that given conflict, in this case, Ukraine. And we have a way to stay a separated self, because we are separate from all the evil people in our scenario. The separation is upheld, the sin and guilt are outside, and the innocence, we took the innocence from Ukraine so that when God finds us, we can say, look, I have identified with innocence. I am innocent. Look at all the guilty ones, right? And that is the principal theme of the ego. There's no way out within the ego thought system. So it's not really necessary, and it's not possible to go through all of that, what we just did, each time we watch the news and we think about this conflict, right? But it is helpful to understand what's going on when we interpret a certain situation, right? Sometimes all we can do is ask for help. I mean, that's always the way to go. If we're unclear what's going on, we can ask for help. That's always a given. Sometimes all we can do is ask for help. At other times, we can dive a little bit deeper into the ego and we can think about it a little more, like we just did. At the very least, though, as a course student, I think, we might be able to acknowledge that our way of seeing any kind of conflict, if it doesn't give us peace, we must have decided wrongly, right? If we look at a certain situation, if we look at the Ukraine, and looking at it does not give us peace, it is because we have decided to look at the situation with the ego, not with the Holy Spirit. It has nothing to do with the situation, as we will see in a little bit. And here's the problem, especially with something like this, where we have a clear cut in our interpretation, a clear cut good and evil. The problem is that it feels so good to identify with Ukraine, with the innocent, right? It feels so good to see Ukraine as the hero, the good ones, and Putin and Russia as the bad guys. We can't avoid it. As long as we live in this body, we cannot avoid it. But it's also very important to realize how much we have believed the ego, right? And how much we still believe it. We believe Putin is guilty and Ukraine is innocent. Forget all the conspiracy theories that are out there. They're nothing, right? They're but shadows of the real and the much bigger conspiracy theory that says that we are sinful and that the separation actually happened. That is the true conspiracy theory. All the others just come from that one. If we follow each conspiracy theory in this world back, it is always the conspiracy of the ego. That we're sinful and that we're an individual. So, once we reached step 2, and we looked at our wish to see the Ukraine invasion exactly as how we see it, we can ask for help to see it differently. The correction does not come from us. The correction comes from Jesus or the Holy Spirit, right? So it would be a mistake to try to go from step one when we realize we think Ukraine is innocent and Putin is guilty, right? Try to go from step one immediately to step three. You want to see it how Jesus sees it. I think that would be a mistake, because step two is, for me, the most important step. They're all important, but the step number two, when we take the mind, when we take our attention from the world back into our mind and realize that if we see the invasion of Ukraine a certain way, it is because we want to see it a certain way, so that our innocence is guaranteed and the separation is ongoing. We have to look at that. It doesn't make sense to ask Jesus for help while we still think the problem is outside. Jesus can't do anything about it. He can't do anything anyway. He's a presence within us, right? And we look at the darkness, at how we see the Ukrainian invasion. We realize this is what we want to see because we have made a bargain with the ego so that we can be innocent. That's what we need to bring to Jesus, right? So step three is forgiveness. So Jesus' goal with this course, right? Especially the text, but basically throughout the whole book, is for us to become aware of what's really happening when we react to something outside, right? It's not to make us feel guilty, obviously, but it's to prepare us to look at our ego a little more closely, all the way, eventually, to the very foundation of the ego, where we believe with every fiber of our being that we killed God, right? That we did an unnameable evil thing. And because we did that, we are that. Like lesson 93 says, you are the home of evil, darkness, and sin. That's what we believe of ourselves. And those aren't just words. Though this is an actual belief we hold very deeply about ourselves when we're with the ego. In fact, we believe because of what we did, we deserve to die, but very slowly, under a tremendous amount of pain and discomfort. That's what we believe when we're with the ego. None of that is real, right? None of what we believe of ourselves, all the sin, guilt, this game of death, kill, be killed, none of that is real, but we believe it, and we want to believe it because we want to uphold the separation, right? We don't want to give it up. We don't want to give up that individual self. And part of the task of the course is to get us in touch with, yes, you believe you're an individual, but look at the pain that it causes you, right? There's no peace there. There's no peace in how you see yourself. There's absolutely no peace. You can steal crumbs that fall under the table, but you can't have real peace while you believe you're a sinful, guilty self. So once we do step one, once we do step two, step three is not up to us, right? Step three is we ask Jesus for help to look at the ego with us, how we interpret the situation, to look at our wish to see the Ukraine invasion by Russia a certain way so that we can identify with the innocent against the guilty, right? But that's it. That's all the work we need to do. We need to do step one and we need to do step two. That's it. There's no other work for us to do. The correction is not our task. not our job. So I can just speak about myself. We might have all kinds of thoughts afterwards about it, like, did it work? Or what am I supposed to feel now that I asked for the correction? Or what if it didn't do anything, right? I still feel the same way. It must not have worked. I must not have done it right. None of those thoughts have any influence on the outcome of this. They don't really matter at all, other than they show us that we've just gone back to the ego, right? We were too scared of the correction, so we go right back to the ego. It's a very normal reaction. We can look at those thoughts as well when they come up, right? But it's good to learn over time that it's not our job to provide the correction. It is only our job to look at the ego and look at our wish to see what we see. And it's not our job to do the correction. We will have thousands and thousands of those situations over the course of our process with this course. We do the work and we move on, right? The extension of forgiveness is not our job. Step 3 is not up to us. We look at the ego and we ask for help. That's it. We can be certain that each time we look at a situation with Jesus or the Holy Spirit, each time we look at our ego and our wish to see a situation a certain way, we have done the very maximum we can do. There's absolutely nothing else we can do. Let's go back to the Ukraine invasion. We can be certain, however we see the situation, however mixed up our feelings are, and we're identified with the innocence and all this stuff, right? We can be certain that the love that is beyond the veil that we have drawn across the world, the veil of hatred, of our ego, is still there. That love is untouched by what we try to do. That love is unchanged forever, right? However dark we perceive the situation to be, however dire the situation is, through our perception, love flows unencumbered between us and what's going on, between all the parties involved. That is what the introduction to the Course means when it says, nothing real can be threatened, nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. The love that is behind the veil that we have drawn across is unchanged. So looking at our ego, right? And that's something that we're not so sure about as Course students. And Jesus describes that when he says, you think your part is so big, right? And you're almost insulted when you find out that your part is very small. Our part in this is very, very small. And looking at our ego with Jesus or the Holy Spirit helps to release us. It releases us. Even if it's only for one fraction of an instant, it releases us to the love that is behind the veil. And that moment is like a window into the world Jesus wanted to give us since we first met him, when we first met this Course, or before. This world, which the Course calls the real world, is a world where Russian soldiers and Ukrainian soldiers are both seen as the Son of God. Where Putin and everyone involved is a son of God that believed for an instant that the tiny mad idea is real, and that our home in heaven was destroyed We all believe exactly the same thing. Some believe it in Russian, some believe it in English, some believe it in Arabic. We all believe exactly the same thing. So we'll know, and I think that's a really good barometer for where we are at every given moment, right? We know we're looking through forgiving eyes at the conflict when we see both sides, victim and victimizers, good guys and bad guys, in the very same light. We feel the very same thing for both. If we don't feel that, we go back to step one, right? Putin is one of the costumes the separated Son of God cloaked himself so that God couldn't find him, right? Anyone involved, from the oligarchs to the military to the Ukrainian people to us as observers, are part of one single minuscule part of God, trying desperately to keep our individual lives intact against this overwhelming force that we think God would throw upon us if he would find us. All involved have the very, very same problem, right? And the healing is accomplished in looking at our ego and our interpretation of how we see this conflict and asking for help to see it differently. That's how healing is accomplished. Nothing else will really help. For this to happen, for this to happen, all we need to do is look honestly at our perception of the problem. And the Course says, all that is needed is you look upon the problem as it is, and not the way that you have set it up. And not the way that you have set it up. We even have this in Shakespearean meter, right? And not the way that you have set it up. We have set up the problem. There are innocents and there's the guilty one, and I am with the innocent. What it really is, that all of us are striving for the very same thing, right? We're all afraid of God's wrath, and we all believe we're sinful, guilty creatures. And for all of us, our individual existence is worth more than the peace of God. That's what unites us, right? Same interest. So, now, once we have gone through the steps, once we do the work that we do as Course students, right? And that's the only thing that's different from somebody that isn't a Course student. And that's a very small thing that happens inside our mind while we look at the news. We go through the steps in our mind, and then we organize a crowdfunding site, we send food, we watch the news, or we discuss what's going on with a friend, or we stay quiet about it, whether we join the fight physically or we write a blog about it, right? Most importantly, we join with others, whatever we might do. The principles of the Course, as discussed in the segment I did before, was called "This Course is not for other people." So the principles of the Course apply first and foremost to us, to the Course students. And the Course says this is all an illusion, all this stuff. But that doesn't help in that situation. That doesn't help anybody. What helps is look at the conflict as we think it is. Then we look at the conflict as it really is, our interpretation, our wish to see it a certain way. Then we ask for help. That's the end, right? And then we do whatever we feel is the right thing to do. we give money, we're back in the illusion, right? We all we want to do is not separate from others. If our friends all do a fundraiser and we don't want to give money for the fundraiser because we think, oh, no, this is not a real war. This is an illusion. That doesn't help anybody, right? We don't want to separate from our sphere. We want to be the same as everybody else. If everybody else looks at the TV screen in horror and we say, "But death isn't real," the Course doesn't teach that. The Course teaches that to us, but for us then the job is to ask Jesus to look at that differently. And then we go out into the world, back into the illusion, and do whatever is needed on the physical level, right? I want to close this with a paragraph that it's kind of the outcome of looking at this conflict with Jesus. Now, this is an ideal that only on the rarest of occasions we can actually experience. But that is what Jesus' goal for us is. Once we have gone past the ego, this is what we have. Once we have honestly looked at our ego, this is what awaits us once we're ready. This way of seeing the world does not come from us, right? This is the corrected view of the Holy Spirit that we can share when we connect with the Holy Spirit. It's a completely different experience from how we look at things right now. It says, this is in chapter 20, section 8. It says, when you have looked on what seemed terrifying and seen it change to sights of loveliness and peace, when you have looked on scenes of violence and death and watched them change to quiet views of gardens under open skies, with clear, life-giving water running happily beside them in dancing brooks that never waste away, who need persuade you to accept the gift of vision? And after vision, who is there who could refuse what must come after? Think but an instant just on this. You can behold the holiness God gave his Son. And never need you think that there's something else for you to see. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next time.